Early 1944, Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. A P-51 Mustang's test pilot rested his hand on the throttle and pushed past the usual war emergency settings. The engine answered with a roar as boost climbed to 75 inches of mercury, fed by a newly developed fuel labeled simply as 150 grade. The airspeed needle swept into territory Allied fighters had barely grazed before. At 25,000 feet, the Mustang ran through 448 miles per hour. Engineers watching from the ground exchanged stunned looks while the pilot's voice came over the radio. This was not a marginal improvement. It was a true jump in capability, an advantage born not of a new airframe or a daring tactic, but of chemistry, a high-performance fuel that would upend German expectations about American fighters. What the Luftwaffe did not yet understand was that Allied fuel scientists had achieved something beyond the reach of Germany's synthetic program, where German fighters typically burned beef or fuel at roughly 91 octane lean, and only rarely had better blends. American refineries were supplying aviation gasoline with a performance rating described as 150. The consequences were profound. On standard 130 grade fuel, a P-51 could manage about 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. With 150 grade, the very same machine, flown by the same pilot at the same altitude, could top 448 miles per hour. Against these numbers, the Luftwaffe's contemporary frontline fighters in early 1944, the Messerschmitt Bf-109G and the Focke-Wulf FW-190A, struggled. The Bf-109G's best altitude speed sat near 400 miles per hour. The FW-190A, around 408 miles per hour under ideal conditions. When Mustangs ran on 130 grade blends, German pilots might still find engagement windows. When the Americans switched to 150 grade, that margin of contest narrowed decisively. Pilots' skill and tactics were suddenly being measured against an unseen technical edge. The story of this edge begins before the war. In laboratories where petroleum chemists studied how fuels behaved under compression octane ratings, describe a fuel's resistance to spontaneous detonation under pressure. Higher resistance permits higher compression and, therefore, more power from each combustion stroke. The principle is simple, but manufacturing high-octane, aviation, gasoline, at scale, is fiendishly difficult. In 1940, U.S. aviation fuel commonly ran around 87 octane, fine for civilian aircraft and basic military trainers, but inadequate for high-performance fighters. Britain, pressed by the Luftwaffe in 1940, collaborated with American oil companies to produce 100-octane fuel in time to help Spitfires and Hurricanes hold the skies during the Battle of Britain. The result was immediate fighters, with the new fuel gained 30 to 40 miles per hour at altitude and climbed hundreds to 1,000 feet per minute quicker. Suddenly, the balance shifted. The next leap, minus 130 grade fuel, became the backbone of Allied air operations through 1943. It powered Merlins and Spitfires and Mustangs, Allisons and Panjang minus 38S, and Hugeprot and Whitney Radius in P-47S. Production expanded rapidly under advocates like General Jimmy Dewey, who had long pushed the military and industry to invest in higher performance aviation fuels. By 1943, multiple refineries were producing high-octane gasoline thanks to catalytic cracking advances, turning crude into the specialized blends fighter engines craved. Germany, meanwhile, remained largely dependent on coal-to-liquid synthetic processes. Technically competent, those plants were slow, resource-intensive, and never capable of matching Allied throughput. Much of the Luftwaffe still operated on lower grade B. For fuel, the better C3 blends were scarcer and inconsistent in quality. Even with extraordinary effort, Germany could not match the combined scale of Allied refining and additive chemistry. To grasp why new fuel made such a difference, remember how internal combustion engines behave. When a piston compresses, the air-fuel mix, pressure, and temperature rise. If the mixture ignites prematurely, an uncontrolled detonation occurs, damaging engine parts. Higher octane or higher performance numbers Let's engines tolerate greater compression and manifold pressures without detonating. Achieving a blend that could tolerate extreme boost required careful chemistry. Famously, tetrathyl lead and aromatic hydrocarbons blended into base gasoline to raise its resistance to detonation. British and American researchers tested many recipes through 1942-43. By early 1943, experimental batches with a 150 performance number had been produced and trialed. The term 150 grade was shorthand. It described a fuel that behaved like 100-octane fuel at lean settings, while offering a performance number of about 150 on rich war emergency mixtures. Dyed purple for quick identification, these blends passed rigorous trials and showed dramatic benefits. On 150 grade fuel, Merlin engines sustained manifold pressures up to 75 INHG, compared with roughly 67 INHG on 130 grade, a jump that translated directly into horsepower. In P51, variants using Packard-built, the rise in available power pushed outputs hundreds of horsepower higher at emergency settings. Flight testing confirmed across-the-board gains. Higher top speed at altitude, faster climb, and more readily available acceleration, and all without changing the airframe. The same Mustang, sumped one day on 130 grade and the next on 150, became a noticeably different aircraft. Operational introduction was deliberate and timed. By early 1944, the 8th Air Force needed not just long-range escort fighters, but interceptors that could dictate engagements. In May 1944, the first consignments of 150 grade fuel arrived in Britain. Distribution was cautious and prioritized two specific squadrons to manage logistics and assess combat effects. The RAF, which had led much of the early testing, also placed the new blend into service, prioritizing aircraft tasked with intercepting high-speed threats like the V-1 flying bombs that began terrorizing Britain in summer 1944. V-1s cruised near 400 miles per hour at low altitude, a speed that pushed many fighters to their limits. Tempests and late Spitfire Marks approached the task, but often lacked margin. Mustangs on standard fuel were marginal. With 150 grade, they gained the necessary speed. Pilots developed daring tactics, including the now famous wingtip tipping of the V-1 to upset its gyro and send it crashing, a technique demanding precise handling and plenty of speed. June 1944, as Allied forces launched the Normandy invasion, saw the first broad combat employment of 150 grade fuel by American P-51 units. Reports from the front soon reached German intelligence. American fighters that could not be kept up with, that seemed to possess reserves of power previously unseen. At first, German officers chalked the claims up to pilot bravado or error. Only later, when fuel samples from downed or captured aircraft made their way to German laboratories and Allied production and supply were plainly evident, did the Luftwaffe confront the reality. Veteran German pilots who flew against late-war Mustangs later testified to the impression those aircraft made. Post-war test flights and interviews confirmed what frontline reports hinted at. Many Allied fighters were being operated at power settings their original designers had only dreamed about. Enabled by fuel performance, those engines could tolerate without some. There were costs. The high lead content and aromatic load of 150 grade hastened spark plug fouling, valve deposits, and cylinder wear. Ground crews adapted. More frequent plug changes, tighter cylinder inspections, and adjusted overhaul schedules. Pilots learned new procedures, monitored manifold pressures carefully, and managed fuel economy, running hard when needed and conserving on cruise legs so long escort missions could still be completed. The extra power burned fuel fast. In the hands of disciplined crews, the payoff was worth the maintenance toll. Combat statistics after mid-1944 tell the operational story. Fighter groups using the higher performance fuel reported improved victory-loss ratios and markedly better interception outcomes. German fighters that had once attacked bombers and escaped now found themselves unable to outrun or outclimb their American counterparts. Encounters that had once favored hit-and-run tactics became perilous for the attacker. Wider strategic effects followed. Allied industrial capacity ensured steady supplies of the new fuel to units across Europe. Germany's synthetic plants, meanwhile, were increasingly targeted by Allied bombing campaigns, further tightening their already strained output. As fuel became scarce, German units curtailed training and rationed flying. Many new pilots arrived at the front with minimal experience. Attrition ate into the Luftwaffe's veteran corps, and by late 1944, experienced air crews were in short supply. By the spring of 1945, Allied air operations often met little or no organized aerial opposition over Germany. Jet designs like the Mi-262 arrived too late and in too small numbers, and they too were hampered by fuel shortages and a collapsing pilot training pipeline. The combined effects of range, pilot training, numbers, and crucially, the chemical edge from advanced fuel blends had helped tilt control of the European sky. Technically, the 150 grade blends offered an operational sweet spot, a lean setting octane of about 104 efficient cruise and a performance number near 154 maximum power when it mattered. The additive load and handling precautions were real. Ground crews learned to manage lead-heavy spills and to mark storage and refueling equipment carefully. Yet despite the increased maintenance burden and toxicity concerns, the clear gains in speed, climb, and power made the fuel indispensable once it was available in quantity. Between mid-1944 and the war's end, millions of gallons were shipped, stored, and pumped into fighter tanks, an industrial achievement that Germany could not mirror. Factories and refineries humming behind secure borders, a mobilized workforce, and logistics stretching across the Atlantic produced not just more aircraft, but better performing aircraft in practice, not merely on paper. In the end, 150 grade fuel was not the sole cause of Allied air supremacy. The P-51's range, American and British training, production scale, and strategic bombing all mattered. But it was a decisive multiplier, where speed and available power let a fighter choose the terms of combat. The chemical advantage made many engagements one-sided. When a Mustang's throttle was shoved forward and the Mustang surged ahead, that surge was as much a product of petrochemical engineering as of aeronautical design. The purple-dyed gasoline that flowed into Allied fighters in 1944 did more than raise airspeed needles. It exemplified the wider truth of industrial warfare. Victory followed the nation that could not only invent, but also mass-produce the materials of advantage. In the skies over Europe, those materials took the form of compression ratios and anti-knock chemistry, and in May 1945, when the fighting ended, control of the air had been settled in part by what lay in the fuel tanks. As the summer of 1944 unfolded, the full effect of the new fuel became apparent across Europe's skies. Allied fighter groups, now flying with an extra margin of speed and power, began reporting kill ratios that dwarfed earlier months. Bombers that had once suffered heavy losses could now reach targets deep inside Germany with far more reliable protection. The Luftwaffe, already battered by losses on the Eastern Front, was suddenly outpaced in the very arena it had once dominated. Aerial combat pilot accounts from this period paint a vivid picture. German aviators who had long respected the Mustang's endurance now found themselves shocked by its new burst of speed and climbing power. Many assumed they were facing upgraded aircraft designs. Few realized it was the same Mustang, its Merlin engine running harder only because of what flowed through its tanks. Luftwaffe intelligence reports dismissed early claims of Super Mustangs as exaggeration. But by late 1944, with combat evidence piling up, the truth became undeniable. German fuel analysts, examining captured samples of Allied gasoline, finally confirmed what their pilots had been. Reporting. The Allies were operating on a performance fuel Germany could not replicate. Attempts to push their own C3 blends further met with mixed results. Production remained scarce, inconsistent, and vulnerable to Allied bombing raids on critical synthetic fuel plants at Luna and elsewhere, even where better blends existed. there was never enough to supply every squadron. By contrast, Allied supply lines poured steady flood of purple-dyed 150-grade fuel into depots across Britain and the continent. By early 1945, virtually every American Mustang group in Europe was running the new blend. The Royal Air Force had likewise adopted it widely for late-model Spitfires, Tempests, and Mustang squadrons. In Britain's desperate battle against V-1 flying bombs, the speed advantage was decisive. Tempest squadrons downed hundreds, with pilots like Joseph Barry and Roland Beament becoming household names for their success. The combat math told the story. Before the widespread adoption of 150 grade, American daylight bombing missions often endured 3 to 6% loss rates per raid, survivable but costly. After mid-1944, those numbers dropped below 2%, even as the missions pressed deeper into German territory. Meanwhile, American and RAF fighter claims skyrocketed. Between mid-1944 and war's end, P-51 groups alone destroyed thousands of German aircraft in the air and on the ground. 4 German fighter pilots. The change was demoralizing. Outnumbered, short on fuel, and increasingly inexperienced compared to Allied counterparts, they now faced opponents with superior machines in every measurable way. Reports describe encounters where American Mustangs simply accelerated out of danger or caught fleeing Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs with apparent ease. Veteran Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland later admitted that by 1944, facing P-51s over Germany was a fight already tilted heavily against the Germans. The industrial reality behind the battlefield advantage cannot be overstated. Producing 150-grade fuel required vast refinery capacity, specialized additives, careful quality control, and secure transatlantic shipping. The United States possessed all these elements in abundance. Germany did not, even at peak efficiency. Synthetic fuel plants produced only a fraction of what the Allies churned out every month. Once Allied bombing further restricted German production, the Luftwaffe was forced to ration even frontline units. Training flights were slashed. New pilots entered combat with a handful of hours against Americans who had hundreds. By early 1945. Luftwaffe aircraft often sat idle for lack of fuel. When they did take off, missions were short and tightly constrained by fuel limits. Some pilots later recalled breaking off combat not because they were beaten, but simply because they lacked the fuel to continue. Allied pilots, by contrast, flew knowing reserves were plentiful. Engines could be pushed hard, and replacements, whether aircraft, parts, or fuel, would always arrive. The ultimate result was an air campaign that grew steadily more one-sided. By March 1945, Allied fighters roamed German skies almost unopposed. On many missions, bomber formations crossed into the Reich, without encountering more than token resistance. Even the introduction of advanced German jets like the Me-262 could not reverse the trend. Too few were built, too many were grounded by shortages, and too many were flown by undertrained pilots against overwhelming Allied numbers. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Allied air supremacy was complete. That supremacy rested on many pillars: the Pi-51's design, pilot training, overwhelming production capacity, strategic bombing, and numerical strength. But woven through all these factors was the quiet, decisive contribution of a chemical achievement. The 150-grade aviation fuel, dyed purple for recognition, turned already excellent fighters into machines that German opponents could neither match nor escape. Speed is the currency of air combat. The ability to climb faster, chase harder, and disengage at will defines tactical superiority. In 1944-45, the Allies bought that currency not only with factories and pilots, but with barrels of high-performance gasoline refined to a standard Germany could never reach. Each time a Mustang surged past 440 miles per hour at altitude, each time a Tempest overhauled a V-1 racing toward London, The unseen hand guiding the outcome was not only pilot skill or aircraft design, but chemistry, the hidden weapon of purple fuel. The tale of 150-grade fuel is therefore more than a technical footnote. It is a reminder that wars are won not only by bravery in the cockpit or brilliance on the battlefield, but also by the quiet work of engineers, chemists, and industrial planners far from the front, in the skies over Europe. Their work transformed crude oil into a weapon as decisive as any bomb or bullet, and when the Luftwaffe finally collapsed, it did so in part because the Allies could fly farther, faster, and higher, powered by a fuel Germany could never produce.